All right, hey, you doing, YouTube? This is part 2 of Psalm 23, verse 4. When I started to do it, I went into like a pre-thing about Corona, COVID-19, and our life right now, which is kind of crazy, right? You know, most people say they're just waiting for aliens to land with like antennas and green things to show up on our planet, you know, to make things even worse. But let's focus in the back of our mind. Think of part 1 of this, and if you didn't hear it, go back and listen to it. Think of that. But let's look into the scripture to see what Paul says. Remember, we started off this psalm, right? Learning that God is sovereign. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. And until God becomes your shepherd, somebody that's completely in control, that knows what he's doing. Okay, remember, he's not a reacting God, but he's a planning God. Okay, and until we get to that point, we're always going to be constantly in want. Okay, but when we realize that the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Okay, and then he explains why. And in the second week, we learned that there's times when God makes me lie down. Okay, Corona could be one of those times where, through economy or whatever, that God is actually making us lie down. Okay, you know, and it says he, you know, lie down in green pastures, something lush and comfortable. Okay, and he leads me beside still waters, and we talked about, you know, when the canoe or the kayak or the raft goes to the side of the stream where the waters are calm, right? That's where the people get in so God can take them to the adventures downstream. Okay, and that's what God's doing, because then we've seen in verse 3 that it says, okay, now that we're in this boat and everything, he takes us on paths. No more are we lying down, but we're on paths of righteousness, of right living for his name's sake. And we learn that everything is about God's namesake. Okay, so now we take all that and we're just keep on building on this, okay? On this sovereignty of God, really. Okay, so Psalm 23, verse 4 says, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil. For you are with me, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. So let's look at this. We're going to break this up into 3 sections, okay? We'll look at kind of like each part at a time. The first part is, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. You know, here David is talking about the shadow of death, of the valley of the shadow of death. So if we're looking at a valley, what do we see in a valley, right? Well, a valley, everything can be clearly seen. You know, we're not in the deep forest. We're not up in the mountains where, you know, we can't see something, but we're in the valley. You know, there's not a lot of trees. It's an open valley, so we can see well. So David is saying, we see death all around us. You know, that's how, you know, we can go on whatever the news feeds are and get the daily COVID results. And things are, for now, they're just keep going up. And this valley of the shadow of death, remember, a shadow is something, the death is there. Now, we're not experiencing it yet, but we can see the shadow of it, okay? This is the thing. So this is a place not hidden. It's a place of despair, right? Anxiousness and despair, you know? So what I was thinking about was, where else in Scripture do we see somebody else in despair like this? Okay, this is what Paul wrote down in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 8 through, I think it was about 10, okay? He said, for we do not want you to be unaware, brothers. He said, of the affliction we experienced in Asia. For we were so utterly burdened beyond our strength that we despaired of life itself. Wow. And in verse 9, he says, indeed, we felt that we have received the sentence of death. But he's saying, just like I was saying about Corona and everything, but this was for a purpose. Okay, so let's look at what he said. Verse 9, he says, but indeed, we felt that we had received the sentence of death. He says, but that was to make us rely not on ourselves, but on God, who raises the dead. He delivered us from such a deadly peril, and on him we have set our hope, and he will deliver us again. You know, We're just getting our life to focus on our life and saying our life in Christ is what matters. You know, there's so many things in the New Testament we can point to this. You know, Paul said, constantly sorrowful, yet rejoicing. I love Luke 21, where Jesus says, because of me, because of my name, because you're proclaiming my name, some of you will be dragged to courts. Okay, some of you will be brought to prison. Okay, so far we're fine. He said, and some of you will be put to death. Okay, and but Jesus said, not a hair on your head will be harmed. Well, you know, people are saying, well, if I'm dead, I don't really care about my hair. You know, but what he's saying, he says, the real you will not be harmed. The real you who worships me, who comes before me, whose your life is found in heaven and in God. Remember, it's about kingdom living. Okay, that's really, you know, when we look at, say, the Sermon on the Mount, that was the whole point of the Sermon on the Mount, was like, this is kingdom living. You know, so what we got to realize is what David said. Okay, he said, you know, even though I'm walking through this valley of shadow of death all around me, right? He said these things are all around me. But this is what he said next. This is part 2 now. Okay, let's look at this a little quickly. Okay, David said next, he says, I fear no evil, for you are with me. You know, it wasn't this blank, I fear no evil. Okay, it was, I fear no evil, for you are with me. For you are a planning God. For you are sovereign in my life. You are in control of my life. You know, in part 1, I brought up this verse, but let's look at it again. Okay, it says, in him, and it's from Ephesians chapter 1, verse 11, right? It says, in him we have obtained an inheritance, right? That's where we got our inheritance. It's in him, right? And it says, we have been predestined according to the purpose of him. Okay, the purpose of God is an interesting study you can do. You know, we see that in Romans 8, right? All things work together for good for those who are called according to his purpose. We see that in Romans 9, which would be a good place to bring your studies to. When you see about Jacob and Esau, you know, God said, you know, Jacob I loved and Esau I hated. And he talks about election, that was done so we would understand election and the purposes of God. So here he's saying again, he says that we have been predestined according to the purpose of him. Okay, who? Who's the who? Well, that's God. Okay, God works all things according to the counsel of his will. You know, so when we look at all this stuff, we right now we say, okay, even though death's all around me, right? Or not all around me, but you know, death's out there, right? He says, I fear no evil, for you are with me. Again, it's not like this vague, blind, not fearing evil. But he said, I don't fear because God's with me. You know, it's the same. How do you get here? Well, it's the same thing as in verse 1. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. If he's not your shepherd, you're going to go on wanting. Okay. If he's not your shepherd, you're going to go around in fear. So he says, I fear no evil, for you are with me. Psalm 139, verse 16. I love this. It more or less, it says, God has planned. Okay, go look it up. He says, God has planned and written down every one of our days, so we can fear no evil. So we can trust a comforting, loving God. Okay, now, you know, sometimes tragedy will happen, and some misguided minister might say something like, well, God was not in that. That sounds nice. Spurgeon said it's horrible. It sounds like, but if there's one part, one avenue, one street, or one block that God's not sovereignly in control, we're in chaos. Okay, where we get comfort is in a God that we know that he's completely sovereign. He's completely in control of everything. Spurgeon said that. Okay. Now, one thing we want to remember. Okay, remember Romans 8:28 through 30 and stuff. Yeah, you know, and everybody loves that. He says, "For God, you know, works all things for good." You know, so what we got to realize. Well, what are the all things? I mean, what is the good? Of course, the all things is everything in our life. But, you know, what we don't realize is part of that, what God says right after that, what he's talking about the good is to turn us into the image of his son. He didn't say he's going to turn it around to give us a Cadillac. He doesn't say he's going to turn it around to give us some nice home or a fancy vacation somewhere, right? Excuse me, I'm just flipping the page of my note here. But that's not what he says. But he says he's going to use it to turn us into the image of his Son. That's the good. That's the good part, okay? And we need to realize that. Now, the funny thing, I mentioned it in part 1, but Francis Schaeffer, who I loved reading all of his stuff, I can't remember which book this was. I should have looked it up, but I didn't. But what Francis Schaeffer said, until you can rejoice in all things, you will not see God work all things for good, okay? Rejoicing in the all things is the key first part. As we start rejoicing over everything in our life, all things in our life, as we start rejoicing after all those things in our life, we're going to see then God turning those all things for good, which is turning us into the image of his Son. So now let's hit part 3, because we're not done with the verse, right? Well, the part 3 says, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. So what do we have, so what do we have so far? So far, we've had that we're walking through the shadow of death, right? Okay. And we said, in that shadow of death, we fear no evil. Why? Because God is right with us, okay? And we're going to look at that right with us right now, because he says, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Now, we could understand the staff, right? That was that big Hurley Cook staff. And when the sheep would get off track, God would take that little staff and wrap it around his neck and pull him back into the fold. But when the sheep kept wandering off, he would have to use the rod and sometimes break the sheep's legs. And at that point, he would pick the sheep up. He would pick up the sheep and he would care for them, put oil on the sheep, bring the sheep into healing. At that point, the sheep would fall so in love, with the shepherd. He'd fall so in love with the shepherd that he wouldn't leave his side. I was thinking, we have 3 dogs, unfortunately. But they're all good. But the youngest, I guess it's the latest one we got. Yeah, the youngest one is this little female dog that follows my old wife around like a shadow. Actually, I think a couple of the dogs follow her around like a shadow. And they kind of look up to her, and everything. And I think that's what I believe David's trying to tell us about. He says about the rod. He says where the shepherd had to sometimes break the leg of the sheep. But that was to get the sheep to fully rely on him, which is really what we see Paul saying. Remember Paul saying in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, he says, and this was to get us to rely not on ourselves, but on God. It's really the same thing. Because now I'm sure we remember, we started looking at suffering, and we start looking at these questions, even looking over David's life. We see all this stuff about suffering, and we're starting to wonder why. So we go back to the book of Job, and we realize, that God said to Satan, have you thought about Job? And Job says, oh yeah, I thought all about him a lot. He said, but you've built a hedge around him. I can't get in. So realize in your life that God has built a hedge of protection around you. And when things happen, that's because God has opened up that hedge. In other words, he wants it to happen. Luther called Satan, he called him really just like a tool of God, So we remember, as that verse we looked at just in Isaiah that we were talking that God's always right. He's always just. He's always holy. He's always righteous. And it's, if you want to look it up, it's Isaiah 5, verse 16. And after all this stuff was starting to happen, this is what Isaiah said. I'll read it one more time so we really get it. It says, but the Lord of hosts is exalted in justice. It says, and the holy God shows himself holy in righteousness. And this is one thing when God is executing judgment. And for us, he's executing purification. This is the last thing we want to look at. If we were to go, I'm not going to read the whole thing in together, or maybe we will. But in Psalm 66, verses 10 through 12, this is what David says. I love this. Let's just go read it. We'll start off. Okay, it says, "For you, O God, have tested us," right? Maybe that's what's going on now. "You have tried us as silver is tried." Verse 11, "You brought us into the net. You laid a crushing burdens on our back." Okay, "You let men ride over our heads." Okay, he said, "You went through the fire and through the water, yet you have brought us to a place of abundance." Did you see that? God's doing all this so he can bring us to a place of abundance. Sure, our place of abundance is when we enter glory with him, okay? You know, when God gets to tell us, "Hey, well done, good and faithful servant." So when we look at stuff like this, we want to realize, you know, like I said, Psalm 139 verse 16 says God's written down somewhere every one of our days, okay? Before there was none, you know, that he's written down. So I just made a list of some famous Christians who died young and some that died old to help us to see that God's in charge, okay? David Brainerd. Now, all these people, I would suggest you looking up their life. David Brainerd's got, there's a book out there that Edwards wrote, and it was David Brainerd's diary. Just a godly man from that Puritan 1700s era. So David Brainerd died at 29. Robert Murray McChain, he died at 29, okay? Jim Elliot died at 29. Something's happening here. Oswald Chambers died at 43. The great Charles Spurgeon, you know, they called him the Prince of all preachers. He died at 57. George Whitefield died at 55. Jonathan Edwards died at 54. Well, then some will say, well, yeah, but long ago they didn't have medicine and people died young. That really wasn't God. Well, in the same era, John Wesley died at 87. Charles Wesley died at 80, okay? And then back in our times, Martin Lloyd-Jones, he died at 81, okay? You know, J.R. Packard died at 92. Billy Graham died at 99, okay? See, what we want to learn and realize is God is in control of everything. So we can witness and love wicked people with no fear, right? So we ask the question again, have you switched roles with the shepherd? Okay. And a good way to realize that, like week one, we said, well, you know you switched roles with the shepherd if you are in constant want. Sure, it's all good to want things, you know, want the vacation. We would like a new car. We want our team to win the Super Bowl, if there's ever a Super Bowl again. Or, yeah, you know, national championship. These are things we want, but they don't control us, okay? You know, he said, so do you have these wants? It's just kind of letting you know that, you know, maybe you and the shepherd have switched roles. Well, here this week we see a good place to see if you and the shepherd have switched roles is when death is all around us, do we have fear? And if we don't have fear, why don't we have fear? Just because we're bold, tough people? Or it's because you realize that God is with me, you know, through it all. So, as we think, next week I'm going to wrap it all up, or when I ever do the next one, verses 5 and 6, so study that. And then we're going to see where we're going to go. But for now, let's just refocus on this. Just realize when everything's going around us, going crazy all around us with Corona, with the death of Mr. Floyd, and which ended up with Black Lives Matter, where we see other good people thinking that it's righteous to actually bow a knee to somebody in Black Lives Matter, even though that's a Marxist, ungodly organization. Okay, we bow our knee to Christ and Christ alone. Okay, so when we see all this stuff, craziness going on, or if Martians land from Mars next week, you know, we see all this stuff going around. It says, you know, well, I can trust God. I can actually draw closer to God during this stuff. So when we think that, let's just keep our heart in prayer, keep our heart in righteousness towards God, and just walk with Him and enjoy Him. Hey, and guess what I did it? I think the first video was 20 minutes, and this one's ending right about 20 minutes. I finally did it. Well, I had to be broken up in 2 parts, but, you know. So realize that God's in control of everything in our life. He's in control of how many days we're on this life and what happens to us in those days, you know. And just because we look at other people, don't think that that's the life that God has for all of us, you know. God's created, we're all equal in God's eyes, but we're not all equal, okay? You know, I would love to have had the mind, right, of R.C. Sproul, or the boldness in preaching and stuff and teaching that, say, like a Paul Washer or Dr. Stephen Lawson have. Okay, but I gotta realize God's created me for who I am with my smaller mind, and I do things that they weren't given to do, because God's created us all differently. So through this, through Corona, through Black Lives Matter, through whatever is going to happen next, because something will happen next. Okay, through it all, through blessings and times of challenge. Okay, realize He's the God of the universe, and He desires to be worshipped. And let's really remember that what we talked about on video 1 there. Okay, and I'm going to read it again. Okay, it's Philippians 1 verses 28 and 29. He says, "And do not be frightened in anything of your opponents." Okay, you can look at Corona as one of our opponents. Okay, don't be frightened by anything of your opponents. He said this is a clear sign to them of their destruction. You want to go witness to some Muslims and they threaten to kill you. Well, that's just a clear sign of their destruction. He says, but of your salvation, and that is from God. Okay. He says, for it has been granted to you for the sake of Christ that you should not only believe in Him, but also suffer for His name's sake. And if you ever want to really read something in the Bible about how secure you are, read Peter. Read Peter. Peter actually says our faith is unfading. It's unperishable. It's all these things. It's secure. And he actually says then, he said, and it is kept in heaven, guarded by God, ready to be revealed at the last time. That's how secure you are. Okay, so God bless you. Have a good week, and like I said, hopefully next week sometime we'll jump into next week to the week after, jump into verse 5 and 6, finish up, and we'll decide where we're going from there. Always verse by verse, context by context. See you later. God bless.